Hello and welcome back to Psychology 303, the analysis of everyday behavior. I'm Dr. Williams, and this is the second in a series of lectures over Chapter B, differential schedules of reinforcement. So in our last lecture, we were talking about differential reinforcement of other behaviors. And if you recall, differential behaviors of other behaviors, or DROs, basically place the misbehavior, the undesired behavior, on extinction and reinforce any other behavior that occurs for a period of time. Maybe 30 seconds, maybe 5 minutes, maybe a half an hour. And for some behaviors, that's acceptable. But remember, too, that one of the limitations of the DRO is that any other behavior might mean that you're looking at other inappropriate behaviors being reinforced unintentionally. When we're concerned that the other behaviors in a DRO might not be the most appropriate behaviors, we can adopt an alternative. It's called the DRA, differential reinforcement of alternative behaviors. One way to deal with misbehavior is to place the undesired behavior on extinction, just like with the DRO. But with the DRA, we then deliberately reinforce a specific alternative and more appropriate behavior. So here we have the DRO, where the other behaviors are not specified, and the DRA, where the alternative behaviors are specified by the person delivering the reinforcement. So an example would be talking out of turn. Let's say I watch every 30 seconds, and if you talk out of turn, that behavior is put on extinction, and no reinforcer is delivered after 30 seconds. Only alternative behaviors, which have been specified, will lead to reinforcement, like doing a worksheet or reading a book or completing an art project. But whatever it is, there's no talking out of turn. The two contingencies are available concurrently at the same time, and the behavior of the client determines the outcome. So the client themselves choose whether they want to engage in a behavior that produces extinction or engage in a behavior that produces reinforcement. Now, this is similar to the DRO, except that the alternative behaviors are now specified. Instead of now saying, don't do that, do anything else, and you'll get a reinforcer, we now have do this, don't engage in this misbehavior, do this alternative set of behaviors instead. It also helps to be instructive about what those behaviors are that will produce reinforcement. To explain to the individual, you need to stay in your seat, you need to stay on task, you need to read your book. Those are things that are going to produce reinforcement. And so the differential reinforcement of alternative behaviors, the DRA, really addresses that big limitation of the DRO in that you can directly instruct the individual as what behaviors will qualify for the reinforcer. So here's a couple of examples. Here we have Alice, and she uses tantrums to escape hard tasks. So you continue to ask her to do the difficult tasks. You no longer allow her to escape. So you're putting her on escape extinction. But you can also reinforce her for asking for help instead. So, and you can tell her, when you start, you're going to say, from now on, we're not going to let you just stop doing this hard task. You're going to have to keep doing it. But if you need help, you can ask for help. So we're putting one behavior, escaping, on extinction, the other behavior, asking for help, on reinforcement. Another example, if Edward gets the prison guard's attention by swearing, you can ignore his bad behavior or his bad language and make the guard's attention contingent on using cool speech. So instead of calling the prison guard bad names, he can call him dude or bro or whatever, and those will still continue to provide the prison guard's attention, but the prison guard will not respond when he calls him inappropriate names. If your husband or your partner behaves badly when visiting your family, don't reinforce his whining, but do reinforce good behavior with trips away from the house with just the two of you alone. So when he's being polite, when he's being nice, when he's cooperating with your family, that's when you spring on him, hey, guess what? I have 2 tickets to the movies, or I have tickets to the ball game. Go visit with old friends, go out to dinner. So provide reinforcement when he's behaving congenially and appropriately around your family by rewarding him with the opportunity to escape. So could be very effective. I speak from experience. Come to my office hours and I'll tell you the story. Okay. Now, sometimes the alternative behaviors don't necessarily prevent the incompatible behavior from still occurring. In other words, a student could be I'm trying to come up with an example. They could be engaging in project-related behaviors, but they're out of their seat and they're disrupting the class at the same time. And so we have another, even more specific version of the differential schedule called differential reinforcement of incompatible behaviors. And with the DRI, the target behavior for elimination is replaced with an alternative behavior that is literally incompatible and mutually exclusive with the undesired behavior. So while you are engaging in the alternative behavior, it's impossible to do the inappropriate behavior. There we go. Okay. So the example here is that now every 30 seconds, talking out of turn is placed on extinction, as it was with the DRA and the DRO. But now, only a very specific incompatible behavior will produce reinforcement. So in this case, it might be raising your hand with your mouth closed is what will produce reinforcement. So raising your hand for permission to speak is incompatible with talking out of turn. The two contingencies, again, are available concurrently, and the behavior of the client, again, determines the outcome. The client chooses between talking out of turn or raising their hand to ask permission to speak. So here are some examples. Stay in your seat and raise your hand is incompatible with being out of your seat without permission. Raising your hand to ask for permission to speak is also incompatible with talking out of turn. Using a Kleenex to blow your nose rather than using your fingers. You can't use a Kleenex on your nose if you've got your fingers up your nose, so they're incompatible. In a play, paying attention to the director means that you can't be chatting with the other actors when you're in rehearsal if you're paying attention to the director. When you're eating, using your fork, not your fingers. Making your bed is incompatible with leaving the blankets all over the floor. Shaking hands with people when you meet them rather than being overly affectionate. This is important for people with developmental disabilities. Often they learn that their immediate family and their immediate caregivers and the people around them will be very affectionate with them. And when they meet new people or when they encounter strangers, they want hugs, or so trying to help them learn an alternative behavior like putting their hand out and shaking your hand replaces that coming forward with a hug. So let's compare the DRA to the DRI. The DRA is slightly different from the DRI. It's often hard to identify behaviors that are truly incompatible with inappropriate behaviors. So it's figuring out how to do a DRA is pretty easy. But figuring out what to do in a DRI is a little bit more of a challenge. So the example I have here is if you have someone who's out of their seat, it would make sense to increase reinforcement for in-seat behavior. That would be a DRI. But if we were also to reinforce raising someone's hand to request, to reply to a teacher's request, they could do that while standing up. That would be an example of a DRA. They could sit in their chair and raise their hand, but they could also get up out of their chair and wave their hand to get attention, and that's not incompatible with your staying in your seat behavior. So in either case, what you're trying to do with a DRA or a DRI is to reinforce behaviors that make the display of your undesired behavior unlikely or impossible. Okay. So when it comes to selecting the alternative behaviors for your differential reinforcement, intervention, you want to select behaviors that are already in the individual's behavioral repertoire. You have to know that they're capable of doing the new behavior. If they're not, you may have to teach the new behavior before you try to use it to replace the undesired behavior. And you want to make sure that you do this before you start your intervention. So you want to do it in advance, make sure that they have the prerequisite responses already established in their behavioral repertoire. Then you can select the behaviors that can be maintained by natural consequences in the environment. So rather than selecting behaviors that require hand-delivered, individualized reinforcers, try to pick things that would lead to natural reinforcement. You can start by adding your artificial reinforcement to that and then fade back to the natural consequences in the environment, the natural reinforcers. You also want to conduct an FBA, a functional behavioral assessment, to determine whether or not the undesired behavior may be serving some communicative function. In other words, the behavior could be telling you something about the individual that you're just not aware of. So if you have someone who continuously interrupts during silent reading and is out of their seat and doing other stuff, it may not be that they're just being disruptive or misbehaving. It may also be serving to communicate that reading is difficult, or that they're not fluent, or that they need glasses, or there could be more information buried in that behavior that you may need to investigate. Ultimately, you're going to select an alternative behavior, and it should be functionally equivalent to the one you're getting rid of. In other words, it should serve the same function. If getting out of their seat and talking out of turn is designed to get teacher attention, then the new behaviors that you provide should also be behaviors that are designed to get teacher attention. If asking or signaling the need for a break from work is functionally equivalent to hitting the teacher to be sent to the office, you're more likely to have that behavior, that new alternative behavior, substitute. If the function of the undesired behavior or the misbehavior, if there isn't a substitute for that, a more appropriate substitute, then they may continue to engage in that behavior to gain access to that reinforcer. So you need to make sure that if escape is part of the is part of the function of a behavior, that both behaviors, the misbehavior and if the misbehavior terminates work, you need the replacement behavior to be a more appropriate way of terminating work. So instead of hitting the teacher or swearing to be sent to the office, they now they ask or they signal, you know what, I really need to take a break, and they're allowed to escape from the activity for a brief period. Now the advantages of using a DRA or a DRI is that it's a very practical approach to managing undesired and inappropriate behavior. What I really like is that although it uses extinction, it really focuses on positive reinforcement to develop skills and appropriate behaviors. It doesn't just tell the student what they're doing is wrong, it gives them an alternative path to those reinforcers. It teaches the child what to do, not just what not to do. That's really important. Extinction alone and punishment alone only tell you what either is broken or doesn't work anymore, or what is wrong with their behavior. The DRA, the differential reinforcement method, also by definition includes positive reinforcement for alternative or incompatible behaviors. And these two procedures have been used with a wide range of problem behaviors, even including things like self-injury. It's been used for off-task, for antisocial behavior, for disruptive behaviors. It's been used for a lot of behaviors and has been shown to be very, very effective. All right. Now, in some cases, you may be asked to help someone not just to replace a behavior, but just to change its level. In other words, the behavior is occurring, but it's just not occurring at a high enough or a low enough rate. So we don't want the behavior to go away altogether. We just want to increase or decrease the rate at which the behavior occurs. So a differential reinforcement of high rates, a DRH, increases the rate above baseline. So many of you are actually engaging in a DRH because your behavior modification projects are things like practicing more or exercising more. I know some of you are practicing your instruments, playing instruments, and have a longer period of practice time. And so you are doing it, but you're raising the bar above where you are at baseline. And you have to meet some minimum standard. The DRL decreases behavior below a baseline. So if you're asking too many questions in class and the teacher pulls you aside and says, you know, you need to ask fewer questions, then you can be the person who uses a DRL on yourself and you set the bar. I can only ask one question in each class. And you can lower that criterion so that you stay below it, and you will effectively decrease the behavior that's occurring at an inappropriate level. Appropriating the conversation. Some people have difficulty letting others have their say. And so, you know, counting the number of people, say you've got 5 people in your group and you have 15 minutes to discuss your project in class, then that means you shouldn't talk more than 3 minutes. And so figuring out what that time is and saying, I have to stay under that 3-minute mark so that you don't appropriate the conversation and appear like a bully. So can be very effective. So the DRH and the DRI are very similar to the other differential schedules, except these procedures involve the differential application of reinforcement contingencies on the degree to which the behavior occurs. So unlike the previous procedures, which are really trying to just get rid of the behavior altogether, here we're using differential reinforcement to ensure that the behavior happens at some minimal rate or at some maximum rate. Excuse me. This is a diagram that I created to kind of describe how these schedules actually nest within each other. And so as you look at this is kind of like a Venn diagram. The DRH and the DRL, the little red circles in the middle, are actually forms of DRIs. So if you're doing a DRH and you have to behave above a certain criteria, then you can't go below. And so it's incompatible to do it a lot when you've only been doing it a little. So they really are very narrow versions of the DRI. The differential reinforcement of low rates of behavior means that as long as you stay below a criteria, you can't be above it. And so the DRH and the DRL are actually subsets of the differential reinforcement of incompatible behaviors. And incompatible behaviors in general are a subset of alternative behaviors. So the DRI sits within the DRA, and the alternative behaviors are a subset of all other behaviors. So I really like this diagram because it shows that what you're doing as you move from one of these differential schedules to another is that you're getting deeper and deeper into more and more specified alternative behaviors. So here's a little diagram that might help. So we have our differential schedules on the left under procedures. So we have the DRO, the DRI, the DRA, the DRH, and the DRL. We have what its purpose is. And so the DRO, the DRI, and the DRA are looking at reducing target behaviors, typically to 0 levels. And the DRA and the DRI do so by increasing other behaviors, such as appropriate behaviors and incompatible behaviors. But the DRH and the DRL are actually increasing behaviors to an acceptable level or decreasing them to an acceptable level that's not 0. The way you manage them differs from the across procedures. So often you are, with a DRO, you're increasing periods with non-occurrences. So you're just making the observation periods longer and longer and longer gradually. So Claire is hitting people, and so our goal is for her not to hit people in a 15-minute period, but our initial observations might only be 30 seconds. And we're going to stretch that out over the course of our intervention until we get to that 15-minute period. The DRI focuses on increasing behaviors that are opposite of the behavior or incompatible with the behavior. So if Dana has a tendency to yell in class, then our goal will be to have her speak quietly in class, using her indoor voice. The DRA is developing functional alternative behaviors. So here Adora will raise her hand to speak for 10 consecutive days in hopes that it will then pick up and become an appropriate behavior. The DRH, we're increasing the rate of the behavior, and so here Ariadna is expected to raise her hand to ask questions on 3 consecutive sessions. We want her asking more questions, not less. We want her engaged more, not less. And so we want to raise her activity level in terms of asking questions. The DRL, the differential reinforcement of low rates, Peter will sit in his seat within 3 minutes of entering the class. That's the goal. And we might start out within 10 minutes, and then with 8 minutes, and then 7 minutes, and 6 and 5, until we get to 3. But the goal here is to decrease how much out of seat time he's doing. But we don't want him to have 0 minutes to get to his seat. He needs to have a reasonable amount of time to get to his seat. So that's why we would use a DRL instead of a DRA. All right. So what could go wrong? These differential schedules are pretty powerful. Well, when using differential schedules of reinforcement, it's really vital to understand some very fundamental things. One, it's very important that you have identified several reinforcers so that your client doesn't get bored. We want to make sure that they stay interested, and that you have tricks up your sleeves in terms of reinforcement to keep them guessing and keep them interested. And second, it's really important that you identify appropriate behaviors that you can use as replacements that already exist within the client's abilities. We want to know that they can do them. So if we expect them to engage in a behavior that they don't know how to do, it's not going to be very successful. So you have to make sure that you do your homework on both of these issues, making sure you have good reinforcers, varied reinforcers, and that you have identified appropriate, doable behaviors for that client. What else could go wrong? Third, it's important to determine how frequently to reinforce the replacement behaviors. You have to find a balance. Early on, you might want to reinforce frequently, but you want to slowly spread out the reinforcers so they're not occurring too quickly. Remember that if you reinforce too infrequently, it may not be enough to strengthen the behavior that you're using to replace the unwanted response. If it's too frequent, they may satiate on the reinforcer, so you want to make sure that they're still engaging in the behavior during the relevant critical time, and that they're getting enough reinforcement to keep them interested, but not so much that they get bored and go off and engage in other misbehaviors. Finally, it's very critical that the person responsible for delivering the reinforcement knows the what, when, and how much of the intervention they should use, how much of the reinforcement they should use. So if you are the intervention specialist, you need to know this. On the other hand, if you're consulting with a parent or consulting with a teacher, you need to know that they understand what differential schedules are, how they work, and know what and where and when and how much of the intervention and the reinforcement that they're going to be using it for what behaviors. And that person also needs to be creative in understanding what to do if problems arise. So, for example, what happens if you do use too much reinforcement and too much teacher attention, and now the kid doesn't want your attention, doesn't care, and is more interested in getting approval or attention or laughter out of their friends. So you should have some little sneaky backup tricks to new alternative behaviors. So in a classroom where you have a child who's satiated on teacher attention, doesn't care that you're ignoring them, and starts going back to their old behavior, you might want to consider choosing a different alternative behavior with a different kind of reinforcer. So when I think of kids who are, getting up out of their seat and disrupting class, if they've been doing fairly well for a little while with your DRA or your DRI, and then they start to kind of satiate on all of that attention and approval from the teacher, then you might just out of the blue say, hey, you know what? I need someone to do Xeroxing for me. And pick 2 kids, one of them my problem child, and one of them a very good child, to go to the office and deliver papers to be reinforced. It's reinforced. This behavior allows them to escape for a little while. It gets them away from you for a little while and allows that satiation to dissipate. It gives them the opportunity. They're still supervised by a child who knows how to behave appropriately. So you want to have little things up your sleeve to deal with things like satiation. Okay, so I'm going to stop here on chapter 15 and move on to chapter 19. I think that's the next one. And I hope you have a good afternoon of studying.